All right, good morning, student, and welcome to the Harvest Bible Institute and Theological Seminary. This is Dr. Adam Johnson, and we'll be continuing on our theological and depth studies on the books of the Bible. Now, these will be summarial books to fill in points that have previously been alluded to in your other courses, perhaps your Old and New Testament theology or your Old Testament hamartiology or soteriology courses and New Testament soteriology courses so that you can understand more fully some of the specifics about these books that may not have been major events, but nonetheless are important in the scripture. So basically, this course is for the purpose of filling in knowledge which you've already found foundations of in previous courses. Now, with that said, dear student, we are going to tackle both 1st and 2nd Kings in this lecture, Lord willing. And with that said, let's get right into the study. Now, the books of 1st and 2nd Kings, just like 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Chronicles, are actually one literary work. They are called in Hebrew tradition simply Kings. The division of the works in the two books was introduced by the translators early on in Christian history, and they were subsequently followed in Latin and Coptic and Syriac, and that's how we ended up with what we have now. In around 1448, the division into two sections also appeared in a Hebrew manuscript and was perpetuated in later printed editions of the Hebrew text. Both the Latin Vulgate further designated Samuel and Kings in a way that emphasized the relationship of the two works. This, together with Samuel, helps relate the whole history of the monarchy from its rise into the ministry of Samuel to its fall at the hands of the Babylonians. Now, the division between 1st and 2nd Kings has been made at a somewhat arbitrary and yet appropriate place shortly after the deaths of Ahab of the northern kingdom and Jehoshaphat of the southern kingdom. Placing the division at this point causes the account of the reign of Ahaziah of Israel to overlap the end of 1st Kings and the beginning of 2nd Kings. The same is true of the narration of the ministry of Elijah, which for the most part appears in 1st Kings chapters 17 through 19. However, his final act of judgment and the passing of his cloak to Elisha at the moment of his ascension to heaven in a whirlwind are contained in 2nd Kings chapter 1, verse 1 to 2nd Kings chapter 2, verse number 17. Now, while there is little conclusive evidence as to the identity of the author of 1st and 2nd Kings, Jewish tradition credits Jeremiah or Samuel. Now, personally, I feel like that Samuel is probably the more likely choice. But regardless, we can clearly see in the scripture that it is, of course, holy canon, and so we will leave it at that and let other people debate over who wrote it. But Jeremiah or Samuel, or the traditionally accepted authors, they would have had to have been familiar with the book of Deuteronomy. Because of what is written in there, it's very clear that it was following what Moses had written. It's also clear that he used a variety of sources in compiling his history of the monarchy. 3 such sources are named: the book of the Annals of Solomon, chapter 11, verse 41, the book of the Annals of the Kings of Israel, chapter 14, verse 19, and the book of the Annals of the Kings of Judah, in chapter 14, verse number 29. It is therefore likely that other written sources were also employed, such as those mentioned in Chronicles, which we'll deal with here in just a moment. Now, student, while some scholars have concluded that the 3 sources specifically cited in 1st and 2nd Kings are to be viewed as official court annals from the royal archives in Jerusalem and Samaria, this is by no means certain, though it is likely. It seems at least questionable whether official court annals would have included details of conspiracies such as those referred to in chapter 16, verse 20, or 2 Kings chapter 15. It may also be questionable whether official court annals would have been readily accessible for public scrutiny, as the author clearly implies in his reference to them. Such considerations, however, student, have led some scholars to conclude that these sources were probably records of the reigns of the kings of Israel and Judah compiled by the succession of Israel's prophets spanning the kingdom period. First and Second Chronicles makes reference to a number of such writings. For instance, the records of Samuel the seer, the records of Nathan the prophet, and the records of Gad the seer over in First Chronicles chapter 29. Let me find it for you, student. First Chronicles 29, verse 29. You also have the prophecy of Ahijah the Shilonite and the visions of Iddo the seer over in Second Chronicles chapter 9, verse 29. The records of Shemaiah the prophet in Second Chronicles 12:15. The annals of Jehu son of Hanani over in Second Chronicles chapter 20, verse 34. The annotations on the book of the Kings in Second Chronicles chapter 24, verse 27, and of course the events of Uzziah's reign recorded by the prophet Isaiah, son of Amoz, over in Second Chronicles 26:22, and it's mentioned again in chapter 32. Let me find it for you. Second Chronicles chapter 32, verse 32. There may have also been others. It seems also likely, for example, student, that for the ministries of Elijah and Elisha, the author depended on a prophetic source, perhaps from the 8th century, that had drawn up an account of these two prophets in which they already compared with Moses and Joshua. However, this, while the typical understanding, I don't hold to. I believe there's evidence in the book of 1 Kings that Elijah wrote his own prophetic account. Now, we'll talk about that later on. But for the sake of this discussion, that's the common belief. Now, most scholars place the date of composition of 1st and 2nd Kings in the time subsequent to Jehoiakim's release from prison, which is approximately 562 years before Christ, according to 2 Kings chapter 25, verses 27 to 30. And places this prior to the end of the Babylonian exile in 538. This position is challenged, however, by others on the basis of statements in 1st and 2nd Kings that speak of certain things in the pre-exilic period that are said to have continued in the existence to this day. For instance, 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 8, the poles used to carry the ark. Chapter 9, verse 20 and 21, conscripted labor. Chapter number 12, verse 19, Israel in rebellion against the house of David. 2 Kings chapter 8, verse 22, Edom in rebellion against the house of Judah. From those statements, it seems to be argued that the writer must have been a person living in Judah in the pre-exilic period rather than in Babylon in post-exilic times. If this argument is accepted, though, one must conclude that the original book was composed about the time of the death of Josiah, and that the material pertaining to the time subsequent to his reign was added during the exile at around 550 BC. While this two-edition viewpoint is possible, it rests largely on the to this day statements, which again are whimsy at best. An alternative to this option is to understand these statements as those of the original source used by the author, rather than statements of the author himself. A comparison of 2 Chronicles 5:9 with 1 Kings 2 Chronicles 5:9 with 1 Kings 8:8 suggests that this is a legitimate conclusion. Chronicles is clearly a post-exilic writing, yet the wording of the statement concerning the poles used to carry the ark that are still there today is the same as Chronicles as it is in Kings. Probably the chronicler was simply quoting his source, namely 1 Kings 8:8. There's no reason that the author of 1st and 2nd Kings could not have done the same thing in quoting from his earlier sources. This explanation allows for posting a single author living in exile using the source materials at his disposal, which would namely have been the writings of the prophets and the kings. Now, the theme of 1st and 2nd Kings is kingship and covenant. Kingship and covenant. That's the theme. The Book of the Kings contains no explicit statement of purpose of theme, but the reflection on its content, however, student, reveals that the author has selected and arranged his material in a manner that provides a sequel to the history found in 1st and 2nd Samuel, a history of kingship regulated by covenant. In general, 1st and 2nd Kings describes the history of the kings of Israel and Judah in the light of God's covenants. The guiding thesis of the book is that the welfare of Israel and her kings depended on their submission to and reliance upon Israel's covenant God. Now this is a throwback to their obedience to the Sinaitic covenant regulations and their faithful response to God's prophets. It seems not to be the author's intention to present a social, political, and economic history of Israel's monarchy in accordance with the principles of modern historiography. The author repeatedly refers to the reader to other sources for more detailed information about the reigns of various kings. For instance, 1 Kings 11:14, 1 Kings 14:19, and also in verse 29. 1 Kings 15:7 and 31. 1 Kings chapter 16, verse 5, and verse 14, and verse 20, and verse 27, for examples. And he seems to give a covenantal rather than a social or political or economic assessment of their reigns. From the standpoint of a political historian, Omri would be considered one of the more important rulers in the northern kingdom. He established a powerful dynasty and made Samaria the capital city. According to the Moabite stone, Omri was a ruler who subjugated the Moabites to the northern kingdom. Long after Omri's death, Assyrian rulers referred to Jehu as the son of Omri, either mistakenly or merely in accordance with their literary conventions when speaking of a latter king of a realm. Yet, in spite of Omri's political importance, his reign is dismissed in 6 verses in chapter 16, verses 23 through 28 of the book of 1 Kings, with the statement that he did evil in the eyes of the Lord and sinned more than all those before him. Similarly, the reign of Jeroboam II, who presided over the northern kingdom during the time of its greatest political and economic power, is treated only briefly in 2 Kings chapter 14, verses 23 through 29. Another example of the writer's covenantal rather than merely political or economic interest can be seen in the description of the reign of Josiah of Judah. Nothing is said about the early years of his reign, but a detailed description is given of the reformation and renewal of the covenant that he promoted in his 18th year of as king, which is seen in 2 Kings chapter 22, verse 3 through chapter 23, verse 28. Nor is anything said of the motives leading Josiah to oppose Pharaoh Necho of Egypt at Megiddo, or of the major shift in geopolitical power from Assyria to Babylon that was connected with this incident, which you can also see in 2 Kings chapter 23, verses 29 through 30. It becomes, however, apparent then that the kings who received the most attention in 1 and 2 Kings are those whose reign there was either noble derivation from or affirmation of the covenant, the significant interaction between a king and God's prophet. Ahab, the son of Omri, is an example of the former, which is seen in chapter 16, verse 29 through chapter 22, verse 39. His reign is given extensive treatment, not so much because of its extraordinary political importance, but because of the serious threat to covenant fidelity and continuity that arose in the northern kingdom during his reign. Ultimately, the pagan influence of Ahab's wife Jezebel, through Ahab's daughter Athaliah, whether she was Jezebel's daughter is unknown, nearly led to the extermination of the house of David in Judah in 2 Kings chapter 11, verses 1 through 3. Manasseh, who is mentioned over in 2 Kings chapter 21, verses 1 through 18, is an example of a similar sort. Here again, it is derivation from the covenant that is emphasized in the account of his reign rather than political features, such as the involvement in the Assyrian-Egyptian conflict, which is mentioned in Assyrian records but not in 2 Kings. The extreme apostasy characterizing Manasseh's reign made exile for Judah inevitable, according to 2 Kings chapter 21, verses 10 through 15, and chapter 23, verses number 26 and 27. However, on the positive side, Hezekiah, which is recorded over in 2 Kings 18:1 through chapter 20, verse 21, and Josiah from 2 Kings 22:1 through 23:29, are given extensive treatment because of their involvement in covenant renewal. These are the only 2 kings given unqualified approval by the writer for their loyalty to the Lord, according to 2 Kings chapter 18, verse 3, and 2 Kings chapter 22, verse number 2. It is noteworthy that all the kings of the northern kingdom are said to have done evil in the sight of the Lord and walked in the ways of Jeroboam, who caused Israel to sin, which can clearly be seen in chapter 16, verse 26, chapter 22, verse 52 of 1 Kings, and then the book of 2 Kings, You have chapter 3, verse 3, and chapter 10, verse 29. It was Jeroboam who established the golden calf worship at Bethel and Dan shortly after the division of the kingdom, which is seen in chapter 12, verse 26 through 33, and chapter 13, verses 1 through 6. Now, while the writer depicts Israel's obedience or disobedience to the Sinaitic covenant as decisive for her historical destiny, he also realizes the far-reaching historical significance of the Davidic covenant, which promised that David's dynasty would endure forever. This is particularly noticeable in references to the lamp that the Lord had promised David in chapter 11, verse 36, in chapter 15, verse 4, and also in 2 Kings chapter 8, verse 19. In fact, you could even look at, let me find the verse for you. You could even look at 2 Samuel chapter 21, verse 17. It also appears in more general references to the promise to David, such as in chapter 8, verse 20 and 25, and its consequences for specific historical developments in Judah's later history, in chapter 11, verses 12 to 13, and 2 Kings chapter 19, verse 34, as well as 2 Kings chapter 20, verse number 6. In addition, the writer uses the life and reign of David as a standard by which the lives of later kings are measured. You can see this clearly throughout the entire Bible, but let's take a look specifically in the books we're looking at. You can see this in 1 Kings chapter 9, verse 4, 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 4. Let me take a look here. 1 Kings chapter 14, verse 8, 1 Kings chapter 15, verse 3, 5, and 11, 2 Kings chapter 16, verse 2, 2 Kings chapter 18, verse 3, and 2 Kings chapter 22, verse 2. Now, another prominent feature of the narratives of 1st and 2nd Kings is the emphasis on the relationship between prophecy and fulfillment in the historical developments of the monarchy. On at least 11 occasions, a prophecy is recorded that is later said to have been fulfilled. And we can look at some of these. Let's take a look, for example, at 2 Samuel 7:13. You can also cross-reference over at 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 20. 1 Kings chapter 11, verses 29 to 31, and also 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 15, as well as 1 Kings chapter 13. The result of this emphasis is that the history of the kingdom is not presented as a chain of chance occurrences or the mere interplay of human actions, but as the unfolding of Israel's historical destiny under the guidance of an omniscient and omnipotent God, Israel's covenant Lord, who rules all history in accordance with his sovereign purposes and will. Now, the writer here also stresses in the book of 1 Kings, student, the importance of the prophets themselves and their role as official emissaries from the court of Israel's covenant Lord, the great king to whom Israel and her king were bound in service through the covenant. The Lord sent a long succession of such prophets to call king and people back to covenant loyalty, which you can see in 2 Kings chapter 17, verse number 13. For the most part, their warnings and exhortations fell on deaf ears. Many of these prophets are mentioned in the narratives of 1st and 2nd Kings. For instance, Ahijah chapter 11, verse 29 through 40. These are in 1 Kings. 1 Kings chapter 14, verses 5 through 18. They have Shemaiah over in 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 22 through 24. You have Micaiah in 1 Kings chapter 22, verses 8 through 28. Of course, you have Jonah in 2 Kings chapter 14, verse 25. You have Isaiah in 2 Kings chapter 19, verses 1 through 7, as well as verses 20 through 24. You have Huldah in 2 Kings chapter 22, verses 14 through 20, but particular attention is given to the ministries of Elijah and Elisha over in 1 Kings chapter 17, chapter 18, and chapter 19, and then also in 2 Kings chapters 1 through 13. Now, reflections on the features of 1st and 2nd Kings seem to suggest, student, that it was written to explain to a people in exile that the reason for their condition of humiliation was their stubborn persistence in breaking the covenant. And bringing the exile upon the people, God, after much patience, imposed the curses of the covenant, which had stood as a warning to them from the beginning, which can clearly be seen in both the book of Leviticus chapter 26, verses 27 through 45, and also, of course, the book of Deuteronomy chapter 28, verses number 64 through 68. This is then made explicit with respect to the captivity of the northern kingdom in 2 Kings chapter 17, verses 7 through 23, and chapter 18, verses number 9 through 12. And with respect also, of course, to the southern kingdom. Let me find the chapter there for you. I believe it's chapter 20. No, it's chapter 21. 2 Kings chapter 21, verses 12 through 15. Now, the Reformation under Josiah in the southern kingdom is viewed as too little too late, which seems to be the case over in 2 Kings chapter 23, 26 and 27, as well as chapter 24, verse 3. Now, this book, then, student, provides a retrospective analysis of Israel's history. It explains the reasons both for the destruction of Samaria and Jerusalem and their respective kingdoms, and for the bitter experience of being forced into exile. This does not mean, of course, student, that there is no hope for the future. The writer consistently keeps the promise to David in view as a basis on which Israel in exile may look to the future with hope rather than with despair. However, in its connection to the final 4 verses of the book, reporting Jehoiakim's release from prison in Babylon and his elevation to a place of honor in the court there, in 2 Kings chapter 25, verses 27 through 30, they then take on added significance. The future remains open for a new work of the Lord in faithfulness to his promise to the house of David. It is important to note, student, although the author was undoubtedly a Judahite exile, and although the northern kingdom had been dispersed for well over a century and a half at the time of the writing, the scope of his concern was all Israel, the whole covenant people. Neither he nor the prophets viewed the division of the Israelite kingdom as a divine rejection of the 10 tribes, nor did they see the earlier exile of the northern kingdom as a final exclusion of the northern tribes from Israel's future. As a matter of fact, many from the north had fled south during the Assyrian invasions, so that a significant remnant of the northern tribes lived in the kingdom of Judah and shared in its continuing history. This seems apparent from Isaiah chapter 10, verses 20 and 21, as well as chapter 11, verses 11 through 13, Jeremiah chapter 31, Ezekiel chapter 48, Hosea chapter 11, verses 8 through 11, Amos chapter 9, verse 11 through 15, and Zechariah chapter 9, verses 10 through 13. Now, there's a chronology here, so we can get these things right in the right time, student. 1st and 2nd Kings presents the reader with abundant chronological data. Not only is the length of the reign of each king given, but during the period of the divided kingdom, the beginning of the reign of each king is synchronized with the regnal year of the ruling king in the opposite kingdom. Often additional information, such as the age of the ruler at the time of ascension, are also provided. Now, of course, then by integrating the Bible data with that derived from Assyrian chronological records, the year 853 can be fixed as the year of Ahab's death, and 841 is the year Jehu began to reign. The years in which Ahab and Jehu had contacts with Shalmaneser III of Assyria can also be given definite dates by means of astronomical calculations based on an Assyrian's reference to a solar eclipse. With these fixed points, it is then possible to work both forward and backwards in the lines of the kings of Israel and Judah to give dates for each king. By the same, it means that it can be determined that the division of the kingdom occurred in 930 BC, as Samaria fell to the Assyrians in somewhere between 722 and 721, and that Jerusalem fell to the Babylonians in 586. This synchronistic data correlating the reigns of the kings of Israel and Judah presents some knotty problems which have long been considered nearly insoluble. In more recent times, most of these problems have been resolved in a satisfactory way through recognizing such possibilities as overlapping reigns, co-regencies of sons with their fathers, differences in the time of the year in which the reign of a king officially began, and differences in the way a king's first year was reckoned. For instance, take a look at 1 Kings 15:33 and 2 Kings 8:25. So that can be helpful to you as well. Now, there is some content here that we want to discuss, student, and just keeping it short here, and then we'll get to our outline for this book. First and Second Kings narrates the history of Israel during the period of the monarchy from the closing days of David's rule until the time of the Babylonian exile. After an extensive account of Solomon's reign, the narrative relates the division of the kingdom and then presents an interrelated account of developments within the two kingdoms. In this account, special attention is given to the ministries of Elijah and Elisha in the northern kingdom. With almost a third of the book, nearly equal to the amount of narrative given to Solomon's reign, devoted to God's efforts through his prophets to turn that kingdom away from its apostasies back to covenant faithfulness, which you can clearly see in 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 25 through 2 Kings chapter 17, verse number 41. Kingship in the northern kingdom was plagued with instability and violence. 20 rulers represented 9 different dynasties during the approximately 210 years from the division of the kingdom in 930 BC to the fall of Samaria in 722 to 721 BC. In the southern kingdom, there were also 20 rulers, but these were all descendants of David, except Athaliah, whose usurping of the throne interrupted the sequence for a few years and spanned a period of about 345 years from the division of the kingdom until the fall of Jerusalem in 586. Now, with that out of the way, student, let's look at this book by way of outline. And we'll keep it fairly succinct here. We're going to get to 2 Kings in just a moment. But by way of outline, let's take a look at a few things. Roman numeral 1, the Solomonic era. The Solomonic era. Chapter 1, verse 1. Chapter 1, verse 12. Chapter 1, verse 12. And then chapter 12, verse 24. All right, under the Solomonic era, under Roman numeral 1, letter A. Letter A under Roman numeral 1, Solomon's succession to the throne. Chapter 1, verse 1, and chapter 2, verse 12. Letter B under Roman numeral 1, Solomon's throne established. Chapter 2, verses 13 through 46. Letter C under Roman numeral 1, Solomon's wisdom. Chapter 3. All right, letter D under Roman numeral 1, Solomon's reign characterized. Chapter 4. Okay, letter E under Roman numeral 1, Solomon's building projects. Chapter 5, verse 1, chapter 9, verse 9. Now, under letter E, we're going to have some some numbers. All right, number 1 under letter E under Roman numeral 1, preparation for building the temple. Chapter 5. Number 2 under letter E under Roman numeral 1, building the temple. Chapter 6. Number 3 under letter E under Roman numeral 1, building the palace. Chapter 7, verses 1 through 12. Number 4 under letter E under Roman numeral 1, the temple furnishings. Chapter 7, verses 13 through 51. All right, number 5 under letter E under Roman numeral 1, dedication of the temple. Chapter 8. Next is number 6 under letter E under Roman numeral 1, the Lord's response and warning. Chapter 9, verses 1 through 9. All right, now back to the letters. Letter F under Roman numeral 1, Solomon's reign characterized. Chapter 9, verse 10, and chapter 10, verse 29. Letter G under Roman numeral 1, Solomon's folly. Chapter 11, verses 1 through 13. All right, letter H under Roman numeral 1, Solomon's throne threatened. Chapter 11, verses 14 through 43. And letter I under Roman numeral 1, Rehoboam's succession to the throne. Chapter 12, verses 1 through 24. All right, student, now Roman numeral 2. Roman numeral 2, Israel and Judah from Jeroboam the first / Rehoboam to Ahab / Asa. I'm going to say it again. Roman numeral 2, Israel and Judah from Jeroboam the first / Rehoboam to Ahab / Asa. Asa. Chapter 12, verse 25, and chapter 16, verse 34. Let's get to some letters now. Letter A under Roman numeral 2. Jeroboam the first of Israel. Chapter 12, verse 25. Chapter 14, verse 20. Letter B under Roman numeral 2. Rehoboam of Judah. Chapter 14, verses 21 through 31. Letter C under Roman numeral 2. Abijah of Judah. Chapter 15, verses 1 through 8. Letter D under Roman numeral 2. Asa of Judah. Chapter 15, verses 9 through 24. All right. Now letter E under Roman numeral 2. Nadab of Israel. Chapter 15, verses 25 through 32. All right. Letter F under Roman numeral 2. Baasha of Israel. Chapter 15, verse 33. And chapter 16, verse number 7. Chapter 16, verse number 7. All right. Letter G under Roman numeral 2. Elah of Israel. Chapter 16, verses 8 through 14. All right, letter H under Roman numeral 2. Zimri of Israel. Chapter 16, verses 15 through 20. All right, letter I under Roman numeral 2. Omri of Israel. Chapter 16, verses 21 through 28. And letter J under Roman numeral 2, Ahab of Israel. Chapter 16, verses 29 through 34. All right, student. Hope you're taking good notes here. Now let's continue on to number 3. Roman numeral 3. Roman numeral 3. Letter A. Well, actually, let's take a look at the title here. Roman numeral 3. The ministries of Elijah and other prophets from Ahab/Asa to Ahaziah /Jehoshaphat, which is found in chapters 17 through 22. I'll say that again. Roman numeral 3. The ministries of Elijah and other prophets from Ahab/Asa to Ahaziah /Jehoshaphat, which is found in chapters 17 through 22. All right, letter A under Roman numeral 3. Elijah and other prophets in the reign of Ahab. Chapter 17, verse 1. Chapter 22, verse 40. Number 1, under letter A, under Roman numeral 3. Elijah and the drought. Chapter 17. Number 2, under letter A, under Roman numeral 3. Elijah on Mount Carmel. Chapter 18. All right, number 3, under letter A, under Roman numeral 3. Elijah's flight to Horeb. Chapter 19. All right, number 4, under letter A, under Roman numeral 3. A prophet condemns Ahab for sparing Ben-Hadad. Chapter 20. Number 5, under letter A, under Roman numeral 3. Elijah condemns Ahab for seizing Naboth's vineyard. Chapter 21. All right, number 6, under letter A, under Roman numeral 3. Micaiah prophesies Ahab's death and its fulfillment. Chapters 22, verses 1 through 40. All right, letter B, under Roman numeral 3. Jehoshaphat of Judah. Chapter 22, verses 41 to 50. All right, letter C, under Roman numeral 3. Ahaziah of Israel. Chapter 22, verses 51 through 53. All right, student, now let's move on to Roman numeral 4. Roman numeral 4, here we go. The ministries of Elijah and Elisha during the reigns of Ahaziah and Joram. 2 Kings 1:1 and 2 Kings 8:15. I'm going to read that again. Roman numeral 4. The ministries of Elijah and Elisha during the reigns of Ahaziah and Joram. 2 Kings 1:1 and 2 Kings 8:15. Letter A under Roman numeral 4. Elijah in the reign of Ahaziah. Chapter 1. Letter B under Roman numeral 4. Elijah's translation. Elisha's inauguration. Chapter 2, verses 1 through 18. All right, letter C under Roman numeral 4. Elisha in the reign of Joram, chapter 2, verse 19, and chapter 8, verse 15. Now we're going to have several numbers under letter C here, so pay close attention now. Number 1 under letter C under Roman numeral 4. Elisha's initial miraculous signs, chapter 2, verses 19 through 25. Number 2, Elisha during the campaign against Moab, chapter 3. Number 3, Elisha's ministry to needy ones in Israel, chapter 4. Number 4, Elisha heals Naaman, chapter 5. Number 5, Elisha's deliverance of one of the prophets, chapter 6, verses 1 through 7. All right, number 6, Elisha's deliverance of Joram from Aramean raiders. That'd be chapter 6, verses 8 through 23. All right, verse 7. Aramean siege of Samaria lifted as Elisha prophesied. Chapter 6, verse 24. Chapter 7, verse 20. Number 8. The Shunammite's land restored. Chapter 8, verses 1 through 6. Number 9. Elisha prophesies Hazael's oppression of Israel. Chapter 8, verses 7 through 15. All right, Roman numeral 5. Israel and Judah from Joram/Jehoram to the exile of Israel. I'm going to repeat that for you. Roman numeral 5. Israel and Judah from Joram/Jehoram to the exile of Israel. Chapter 8, verse 16, and chapter 17, verse 41. Letter A under Roman numeral 5. Jehoram of Judah. Chapter 8, verses 16 through 24. Letter B under Roman numeral 5. Ahaziah of Judah. Chapter 8, verses 25 through 29. All right, letter C under Roman numeral 5. Yehu's revolt and reign in Israel. Chapters 9 through 10. And there's a few points I want to make under this. Number 1, under letter C, under Roman numeral 5. Elisha orders Yehu's anointing. Chapter 9, verses 1 through 13. Number 2, under letter C, under Roman numeral 5. Yehu's assassination of Joram and Ahaziah is recorded in chapter 9, verses 14 through 29. Number 3, under letter C, under Roman numeral 5. Jehu's execution of Jezebel. Chapter 9, verses 30 through 37. Number 4, under letter C, under Roman numeral 5, Jehu's slaughter of Ahab's family, chapter 10, verses 1 through 17. Number 5, under letter C, under Roman numeral 5, Jehu's eradication of Baal worship, chapter 10, verses 18 through 36. All right, letter D, under Roman numeral 5. Athaliah and Joash of Judah, repairs of the temples, chapters 11 and 12. All right, letter E. Jehoahaz of Israel, chapter 13, verses 1 through 9. Letter F. Jehoash of Israel, Elisha's last prophecy, chapter 13, verses 10 through 25. G. Letter G, under Roman numeral 5. Amaziah of Judah, chapter 14, verses 1 through 22. Letter H, under Roman numeral 5. Jeroboam II of Israel, chapter 14, verses 23 through 29. Letter I, under Roman numeral 5. Azariah of Judah, chapter 15, verses 1 through 7. Letter J, under Roman numeral 5, Zechariah of Israel, chapter 15, verses 8 through 12. Letter K, under Roman numeral 5, Shallum of Israel, chapter 15, verses 13 through 16. Letter L, Menahem of Israel, chapter 15, verses 17 through 22. Letter M, Pekahiah of Israel, chapter 15, verse 23 through 26. Letter N, Pekah of Israel, chapter 15, verses 27 through 31. Letter O, Jotham of Judah, chapter 15, verse 32 to 38. Letter P under Roman numeral 5 still, Ahaz of Judah, chapter 16. Letter Q, Hoshea of Israel, chapter 17, verses 1 through 6. And finally, letter R under Roman numeral 5, the exile of Israel and the resettlement of the land, chapter 17, verses 7 through 41. All right, Roman numeral 6. We're almost done here, my friends. Stick with me just a little bit longer. Roman numeral 6. Judah from Hezekiah to the Babylonian exile. Roman numeral 6. Judah from Hezekiah to the Babylonian exile, chapters 18 through 25. Letter A, Hezekiah, chapters 18 through 20. Number 1 under letter A under Roman numeral 6, Hezekiah's good reign, chapter 18, 1 through 8. Number 2 under letter A under Roman numeral 6, the Assyrian threat and deliverance, chapter 18, verse 9, chapter 19, verse 37. Number 3 under letter A under Roman numeral 6, Hezekiah's illness and alliance with Babylon, chapter 20. All right, letter B, we have Manasseh, chapter 21, verses 1 through 18. Letter C, we have Ammon, chapter 21, verses 19 through 26. And then letter D, we have Josiah, chapter 22, verse 1, and 23, verse 30. And we have a few points to make under Josiah, so let's put a number 1 there. Number 1 under letter D, under Roman numeral 6, repair of the temple and the discovery of the book of the law, chapter 22. And number 2 under letter D, under Roman numeral 6, is the renewal of the covenant and the end of Josiah's reign, chapter number 23, verses 1 through 30. All right, continuing on, letter E under Roman numeral 6, Jehoahaz exiled to Egypt, chapter 23, verses 31 through 35. Letter F is Jehoiakim, first Babylonian deportation, chapter 23, verse 36, and chapter 24, verse 7. Letter G, Jehoiachin, second Babylonian deportation, chapter 24, verses 8 through 7. All right, continuing on, student. Letter H, under Roman numeral 6 still, Zedekiah, third Babylonian deportation, chapter 24, verse 18. It's also found in chapter 25, verse number 21. Letter I, the removal of the remnant to Egypt, chapter 25, verses 22 through 26. And then finally, letter J, the elevation of Jehoiakim in Babylon, chapter 25, verses 27 through 30. Now, I want to mention a few of the kings for you, just so you have some information. These would be Assyrian and Persian kings and Babylonian kings, as they pertain to things that are mentioned here in the events unfolding in the Bible, just so you can cross-reference them and do your own personal study, so you can kind of place some of these events. In Assyria, you have Tilgath-Pileser III, which was from 745 to 727 BC. Then you have Shalmaneser V, which ruled from 727 to 722. You then have Sargon II, which was from 721 to 705. Then you have Sennacherib from 705 to 681. Then you have Esarhaddon from 681 to 669. And you have Ashurbanipal from 669 to 627. Then over in Babylon, or as it was called at that time, Babylonia, you have Nebuchadnezzar II from 605 to 562. And then you have Nabonidus from 556 to 539. These are all, of course, BC. And Belshazzar seems to be a co-regency with Nabonidus around the same time. All right, in Persia, you have Cyrus the Great. Some believe this is the same person described as Darius the Mede, who of course slays Nebuchadnezzar when the Medo-Persian Empire comes to play in the book of Daniel. And if that's the case, it could be one and the same. Some people believe that, some people don't. Some people say that Darius First the Great is an actual separate king. Some think that they're the same. I'll let you come to your own conclusion on that, my friends. I just want to make these dates available to you. So you have Cyrus the Great in Persia, 559 to 530 BC. You have Cambyses from 530 to 522 BC. You have Darius the First or Darius the Great from 522 to 486. You have Xerxes, who is known as Ahasuerus in the Bible, from 486 to 465. And then you have Artaxerxes the First, 465 to 424 BC. And then finally Darius the Second, from 423 to 404 BC. Well, now, student, my hope is that we've given you enough of a foundation of this book that you can do your own good and solid study. I would certainly encourage you to read the entire book and make fervent notes in it. While there are certainly other things that we will add to the outline in our discussion over 2 Kings, this has been a general outline covering the Kings as a whole, and this should suffice for you to get a good opportunity to study and to learn and to grow in these things. So we thank you for your attention today. Please know that we pray and we hope the best for each and every one of you, and we pray God's blessing upon you as you study His Word.